Okay, this is Unit 3, Video 4. This is some practice on aggregate demand and aggregate supply and an introduction into fiscal policy, what that is. So the first example we have a short run, aggregate supply, downward sloping, aggregate demand, average price level, real GDP, and I put price level of 1. And we don't know where the output is yet, but we will very soon. So the scenario, when you're given a question, you're told a scenario that you're in, and then something's going to happen to change that scenario, and then you're going to have to try to figure out how do you get yourself out of that bad scenario that you're in. So this scenario says, what if we start the question in a recession? So if you're starting in a recession, the question says you're operating below full employment, or there's a loss in income, or the stock market takes a dive and aggregate demand shifts to the left, it's going to say, show where we are in a recession. So you simply draw a recessionary gap. So where do I put my long run? To the right of the current. And that's my recessionary gap. So long run, aggregate supply. And now I can write my quantity at full employment. And then over here, I can draw my quantity at my current, or sometimes they do quantity 1 and then price level 1, and I drew my recessionary gap. That's the last lesson we did. Now that I have my recessionary gap, the thing is we have lower output and higher unemployment, and that's not good for an economy. There's pressure on politicians to try to get people's jobs back. So what can the government do to get us back to here? Well, according to classical theory, what's supposed to happen is that during a recession, prices go down. So workers should willingly accept lower wages. I would have no problem accepting lower wages, right? Absolutely not. You're not taking away my wage. So in the classical model, that's what they say. What's supposed to happen? Oh, workers will accept lower wages and input prices will go down. So SRAS will shift to the right and it'll bring us back to full output at a lower price level in the long run. And everybody's happy, the world moves on, no problems. But in reality, wages stick. So workers keep asking for higher wages and demanding higher wages, and as a result, they have less income because overall people are losing jobs, and then demand goes even further to the left and further to the left, and we get into a depression, and that takes a long, long time to come out of. So there's two things that the government can do. They can try to manipulate C, or they can try to manipulate GP. How do they do that? Simple. In this case, what would make AD go to the right if the government has some control over? Well, if the government increased GP, then AD would go to the right. That's fiscal policy 1. Another fiscal policy they could do is decrease taxes. That's fiscal policy 2. Fiscal policy is super easy because there's only 2 possible things the government can do. They can manipulate taxes, or they can manipulate spending. So if they do either of these fiscal policies, then the graph let's say they could do a fiscal policy, it's going to make aggregate demand shift somewhere to the right. It could be all the way back to the right or a little bit back to the right, depends on what the question is asking, but I'm going to go all the way back because it makes it look nice and easy. So AD1 to AD2, that'll happen if they do either of these fiscal policies. And now my new price level will be higher, but at least I'll be back to quantity at full employment. And that's what happens. We just had a scenario, and we tried to fix the scenario with fiscal policy. Speaking of fiscal policy, what is it? There are 2 types. The government of the United States controls fiscal policy. There's expansionary policy, what we just did in the problem. And expansionary policy is basically done during a recession, and there's 2 things you can do. You can increase government spending, or you can decrease taxes. If you increase government spending, GP goes up, AD goes to the right. If you decrease taxes, big C goes up, consumption. People spend more. They have more income, more disposable income. So AD goes to the right. If there's not a recessionary gap, if there's an inflationary gap, then the opposite fiscal policies may be the appropriate action. So rather than increasing spending or decreasing taxes, the government could decrease spending, which brings AD to the left because GP went down, or it could increase taxes, which will then make less disposable income for people, so big C will go down. In both cases, AD will go to the left and hopefully close the gap. So, with that being said, let's take a look at this example. So similar example. Let's say we don't start out in a recession. This question says, if we're in the long run to begin with, we start out right here. This is the long run graph, right? Output is the same, price level is pretty good. Everybody's working who can work. There's no, the natural rate of unemployment is like 5%. We're good, we're there. What if we move into a recession? What do you do then? How do you show that? It's a show what happens. Well, if we're at long run, equilibrium, and spending or GP or investment or NX goes to the left, it's going to say, show what happens if this happens. Well, then you would show, this would be my first point, well, the AD goes to the left and creates a recession. AD1, AD2, arrow left, and we have a new equilibrium. So Q1 is now to the left, and price level is now lower, P1 down here. Now that we've shown from long run equilibrium to a recession. What would you do to get out of a recession? There's one of two choices. The government could increase government purchases or decrease taxes. And that's the answer. Done. All right. Next example. What happens in the opposite example? So over here, what happens if you start off in equilibrium, okay? And there's a major oil crisis. What's going to shift during a major oil crisis? Well, not aggregate demand, but aggregate supply. So which way is the short run aggregate supply going to shift? To the left. We call this a supply shock, a negative supply shock. So SRAS2. So that means our price level is going to go up, and our quantity is going to go down. So quantity 1 here, P1, P2, I'll keep it Q2. So what's happened? We call this situation a very unique situation. This is called stagflation. This is the worst place you want to be as an economy because price level is up and the quantity is down. So you say, oh, how do we get out of this situation? It's very difficult to get out of the situation. Because if we do a fiscal policy, that's going to increase aggregate demand, which is going to only further increase prices. So it might create a lot of inflation at the expense of getting some of our jobs back. So this is a rough scenario to be in. Here's another example. What happens if government spending, see we're at equilibrium here, what happens if government spending increases while we're at full employment? Well, if government spending increases, for some reason, politicians say we want to spend more, well then aggregate demand is going to increase, AD1 to AD2. And if that happens, then prices go up, and output is going to go beyond the full employment line, so Q2. So now what do we have? We're producing more than we should be, which is called an inflationary gap. So we have an inflationary gap created. What can the government do to get us out of an inflationary gap? Look over here. Well, if we're in an inflationary gap, we need a contractionary fiscal policy. So the government has one of two choices. They should either decrease government spending or increase taxes, and that will bring aggregate demand back to the left. All right, hopefully get us out of this inflationary gap. Let's look at another example. Let's get what happens if we start in an inflationary gap, right? They tell you, oh, we're overheating as an economy. For some reason, we're overproducing. Okay, so I draw my graph just like this. The long run should be to the left, right? I've got a Q, and this is an inflationary gap. I'm overproducing past the point of full employment. This is what I would draw. What should the government do? Same thing we just said before. We're going to either increase taxes against consumers or businesses, or we're decreasing government purchases. And that'll bring, hopefully, aggregate demand back to the left. We'll show a little arrow. It'll bring us closer towards this point. This will be P2. And I don't have to label that here because it's already labeled. All right. So just some scenarios. The most important part here, know how to draw an inflationary gap, know how to draw a recessionary gap, know how to get out of either of those things with fiscal policy. All right.